guys, so this is what we're actually here for today. This dodgy bearing, the rear of the Pajero, which is going to be ripped out and replaced with a brand new babe. So let's get started. Okay, so this is what we need for today's job. So we need some grease for the axle. We need some penetrating fluid for some of these nuts, which are an absolute pain in the ass to get out. Just a little hammer or a mallet to tap some bits and pieces. Pair of long nose pliers, normal pliers, long screwdriver, flat, small screwdriver, breaker bar. I've got quite a short one just to get in under the wheel arch. You may need a bar or pole to extend that to give you a bit more leverage. Set of ring spanners and open enders, socket set obviously, and also a stand, a little bottle jack, and a larger jack to jack up the car. As well, in this particular instance, with the Pajero, you're going to need a 36mm socket to get the main nut off the axle. You may not have those, you might have to go buy a separate one. I know I did. And obviously a tyre iron. So let's get started. So what we're doing today is actually replacing the wheel bearing. And you can see from the parts list here, in particular with the Pajero, you've got the short wheelbase or the long wheelbase version. But also what you can do is you can actually get the complete hub assembly, which has got the hub attached to the bearing. If you don't get the hub, you can order get the bearing separate, but then you've got to press the hub off. And from the first time I did this, it was an absolute painful experience. It was so difficult to get off, and if you don't have a gear puller or a press to actually take it off, it can be an extremely difficult process. Ended up taking me a full day last time. But since then I've found out that you can actually order the bearing with the hub assembly attached, and it actually costed the same price this time around for some strange reason. So you can either get the bearing on its own or the bearing with a hub assembly, and they both cost the same, which is kind of crazy. So obviously I went with the one with the complete hub assembly. Alright, so let's get started. So before you jack up the car, obviously take the wheel nuts off, then jack her up. Obviously find out where your secure points are. Jack it up, get the tyre off the ground, and then basically pull the tyre off so you can get started. So taking you through everything here. Obviously you've got disc brakes on this version, and you can see it needs to be cleaned up a little bit. You can see it there, and I'll go into the detail later, but that's one of the real problems as to why it actually rusted out the bearing. Your ball joint there, those couple of nuts there will be taken out, and there's a nut hidden under that rubber stopper to stop the car from bottoming out. We'll also be removing the caliper completely, but leaving still the main line attached, the brake line attached. You don't have to remove that. Again, it's a little bit tight in there, but it's not too bad. So what we're going to do now is actually remove the hub carefully without damaging it. This is the problem I encountered last time. My car had been serviced its whole time by Mitsubishi, and one of their mechanics decided to put a hole in the hubcap, and it's allowed water to get in and actually rust the bearing out and cause it to collapse. So I'll be fixing that and sealing that hole up to stop it from actually happening again. Alright, so as you can see here, we've removed the hub. What we're going to do now is actually remove this pin. Basically fold the pin up, take the pin out. It's a pretty simple process. self-explanatory. Close her up, pull it all out. Then after this, there's this little cap which just comes off very easy. Just basically just slides straight out, and then this will expose the main nut, which again, you're going to need the breaker bar for this to try and get this thing off. It was extremely tough. I ended up having to extend the breaker bar. I used a 3/4 inch socket. I suggest you don't use anything smaller. If you do use anything smaller, there's a chance you're going to actually snap it off. What I've also done is put a stand in underneath just to basically give it a bit of support. As you can see there with the breaker bar, I've slightly extended it just to crack the nut. And then once you crack the nut, it's pretty simple and straightforward from there. It just comes off quite easily. Unscrew it off. And then you've got the axle. If you actually push the axle in, it actually will move freely. There's a little bit of play there. Okay, so the next thing is the brake caliper. So there's 2 nuts on this. So you'll at the rear. So you basically take these 2 nuts off, and that will actually allow the caliper to just slide off completely. You'll find that the actual brake pads will stay open when you actually do remove the caliper. I used a bit of penetrating fluid on these nuts just to crack them. And again, use the breaker bar here to basically remove these nuts. They were quite hard initially to get started and taken off. But as you can see there, there's 2 nuts. They screw it off quite easily. And you'll see the actual caliper is very easy to slide off. Use a screwdriver, and you can obviously be careful not to scratch the discs, but basically you can use a screwdriver to actually pry the actual caliper off. You'll see here how you carefully do it without scratching the discs. Now just be careful obviously with the brake line, that you don't put any tension on it or cause any damage to it, and basically just lift it off. I actually put a socket in there to stop the brake pads from closing, but I found that they actually didn't close at all. I thought they might compress on their own, and then just sort of tuck it up out of the way. One of the things, just a bit of a tip too also, is pop a tyre just under the car, just in case it actually does drop. Okay, so here, basically get your little hammer, give it a bit of a tap. Also, you're going to have to release the handbrake. And when you release the handbrake, obviously put a couple of chocks under the front wheel. You'll find this comes off extremely easy. I was shocked how easy it came off. You can see me sort of wiggling it out there. And then basically it just comes straight off. Not an issue, there's no bolts or anything attached to this. And exposes the complete hub assembly and the actual handbrake. Okay, so here's the next job. So we've basically got this ball joint. There's 3 nuts we're going to remove to get this thing off. There's 1 nut underneath that rubber stopper there. Again, needed to crack it with a breaker bar, and it comes off then quite easily. Once you took that off, again, just set that aside. And the next job is these next 2 bolts here. So there's got 2 nuts underneath. Just pop on your ring spanner, socket on top. Might need the breaker bar initially too, just to crack the nuts. Then you can give basically the ball joint. You don't actually have to physically remove the ball joint itself, but you just give that a bit of a tap. Okay, your next job here is to now remove the ABS sensor. So with the ABS sensor, it's pretty simple and straightforward. There's just 1 little nut. You can either use a screw or a socket. It's pretty straightforward. Undo the nut, and the ABS sensor just slips straight out. I made the mistake of forgetting to remove that first, so make sure you do that to prevent any damage. Okay, so your next job here is to remove the lower arm of the park brake assembly. So this is pretty straightforward. You just need a ring spanner, and a socket. Pop the ring spanner on one end. You'll probably need to crack the nut because it is a little bit difficult to get off. So use the breaker bar. Once you crack it, pop your socket on it and just take this off. Now this may need a little bit of persuasion to actually get it out. So what you might need to do is, once you've undone it, just get your little mallet, give it a bit of a tap, and then actually get a screwdriver to end up tapping it all the way through and pop it out the side. And then you can use the bigger screwdriver to actually pry it off its lower arm. It may drop a fraction. Then basically what you do next is you get a screwdriver, put it through the front of the hub assembly, and you can literally pull the park brake assembly forward and push the actual axle through it. There's enough play in there that it'll pop out the other side. Now it may need a little bit of force to actually drop the actual axle down out of position below the park brake assembly. So you just use basically the pry bar or whatever you've got to pull it out. Now there's this little bracket here that we found basically behind the park brake assembly, which actually gets in the way of getting to the actual nuts, which actually bolt the bearing onto the park brake assembly. So basically it's just got two small nuts. Crack those, take that off so it gets it fully out of the way, and then you can move to the next step. Okay, so now that the park brake assembly is almost free floating in that we've disconnected the ball joint at the top and we've disconnected the lower arm, in order for you to be able to basically take the four nuts off the back of the park brake assembly which connect to the actual bearing, you're going to actually need to basically pop one of the bolts back into the top ball joint and actually pop the lower arm back in and just pop basically the pin or the bolt through to secure it. The only reason for this is basically in order for you to get enough leverage to crack the nuts, you need those two bolts just back in place. They don't have to have the nuts attached or anything, just to basically hold it in place so you can actually apply a bit of force and the park brake assembly isn't going to be moving around in the air. Okay, so here's your next step, which is going to be the most fun one. I suggest you take a lot of photos or just refer back to this, but really take close attention to all the bits and pieces in relation to the park brake before you attempt on pulling anything out. It has to go back in a very specific way, so really pay close attention to this. Now, there's these two springs at the top here. So these are quite taut and tensioned. So you're going to need to grab either a set of nose pliers or even just normal pliers, whichever you find that works for you, and actually remove these springs totally take them out. Then what will happen is there's this little device here. Pull this out carefully, pay close attention to where it was. Then you've got these couple of little pins, and the way these work is you use your nose pliers, you grab the pin, push it in, rotate it, and then what happens is these clips then basically fall off, and then the pins at the back will actually fall out too. So these are pretty straightforward. Once you've turned them, they easily pop out, and you just got to remember basically where they go back. Then the whole park brake will basically come out, and they're attached together. There's this little spring at the bottom that holds them together. Again, just make note of where they are. That's basically the full extent of the pulling apart of the park brake. And then that basically exposes everything fully enough now for you to actually remove the actual complete hub assembly and the bearing. Now, as you can see here, with the bearing, there's quite a bit of noise, hence the reason I'm actually replacing it. Okay, so now we're going to crack the four nuts at the back of the park brake assembly. You can see close-ups there. I've already removed a couple. They were quite difficult initially I had to use the breaker bar. I had to use some penetrating fluid on the nuts because it was in quite an awkward position. Where I could with the breaker bar, I tried to extend it to give it a bit more leverage, and then basically crack the 4 nuts. And then once you've cracked the 4 nuts, they're quite short. You just undo them, take them out fully, and then your next job is to actually physically pull the bearing out and remove it. Okay, so this next steps were surprisingly easy. Basically, I just took the mallet, actually got a metal hammer, and I tapped the side of the hub from left to right, to actually wiggle the actual bearing and the hub assembly off the park brake assembly. So after a few hits on each side, and even if it does get stuck, you can actually hit from behind the park assembly and actually hit the rear of the bearing itself, and that should be enough to actually basically work its way loose. Now, as you can see, basically with the bearing itself, it was in a pretty bad shape. There was a lot of rust and whatnot, and in my opinion, this is a direct result of the actual hubcap being pierced and water being able to pour into the actual bearing or remain in where the bearing was and caused it to rust out. Okay, so now before you put basically the new hub on, you've got the park brake off. Take the time to clean everything up, get rid of all this gunk, get rid of all the dirt, and clean the handbrakes shoes up as best as possible. These little pins here, make sure you don't lose those. I'll show you where they go back in later.